Callista had been waiting 3 hours for a text that wasn't coming, staring at a plate of cold lasagna she'd spent her last $20 on in a cramped, drafty kitchen. She didn't know her boyfriend Caspian was currently pinned against a rain-slicked cruiser 3 miles away, his badge stripped and his phone seized. And she definitely didn't know her father, Cornelius Beaumont, was watching it all from the back seat of a heated limousine, personally deleting the "I'm sorry, and I'm coming home" message from Caspian's phone. Cornelius thought he was protecting his daughter from a man who couldn't even afford a decent meal. He had no idea he was actually declaring war on the only heir to the Thorne trillion-dollar legacy, the man who could make the entire Beaumont empire vanish before the lasagna even hit the trash. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here for this incredible journey of love and secrets. And before we jump into the heart of Callista and Caspian's story, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the grand reveal. Also, I love seeing where you're all tuning in from, so drop your city or country in the comments right now. Let's get into it. People who grew up in apartments with water stains on the ceiling tend to romanticize wealth. They imagine the quiet of it, the way rich rooms must feel, like being wrapped in something that never needs anything from you. Callista Beaumont had grown up in rooms like that, and she had spent the better part of 26 years trying to get out of them. The Beaumont estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, sat behind iron gates that had been installed in 1987, the year Cornelius Beaumont consolidated his first hostile takeover and decided that the world needed a physical reminder of what he was capable of. The gates were 12 feet tall and tipped with gold-painted spikes. They weren't decorative. Cornelius had specifically told the contractor, "Make it so they know they're being kept out." What Cornelius never considered, not once in all his years of engineering boundaries and erecting walls, was that the same gates keeping the world out were also keeping his daughter in. Callista had her mother's eyes, warm, dark brown, the color of good coffee before it goes cold. Her mother, Vivienne, had died when Callista was 9, during a February that no one in the house was allowed to talk about afterward. Cornelius had folded that grief into his balance sheets, his conference calls, his acquisitions. He ran harder, built bigger, and somewhere in all that motion, he lost the ability to simply stand still and look at his daughter and see the woman she was becoming. A woman who wanted softness, not strategy. She had tried for years to explain it to him, and over dinners that cost more per plate than some people's weekly grocery budget, under chandeliers that probably had their own insurance policies. She'd try to say, "Dad, I just want something real." And he would look at her the way you look at a number that doesn't add up and say, "Real is expensive, Callista. Real requires protection." But real, she was learning, was also something you could only find outside those gates. She had met Caspian Thorne on a Tuesday in October, and of all the unglamorous days, to meet the person who would reorder your entire understanding of yourself. She'd been sitting in the back of a black car, her father's obviously, stuck in traffic on 5th Avenue during a light rain. Her driver, Harold, was trying to navigate around a cluster of pedestrians who had bottlenecked at a crosswalk. 2 cars ahead. A fender bender had just happened. Nothing serious. And one of those slow-motion city collisions where everybody gets out and immediately starts pointing at each other. And there he was, a patrol officer, tall, broad-shouldered, with rain-darkened hair and a notepad he somehow kept dry by tilting his body to shield it. He was trying to take a report while simultaneously managing traffic. talking to a rattled woman holding a baby on the sidewalk, and communicating something into his radio, all at the same time, without losing his composure for even a second. Callista had leaned forward in the seat. Harold caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "Should I go around, Miss Beaumont?" "No," she said. "Wait." She watched him for 4 more minutes. 4 minutes of someone doing a difficult, underpaid, thankless job with a kind of quiet competence that she hadn't seen in a boardroom, at a charity gala, or in any of the manicured spaces where she'd spent most of her life. He helped the baby's mother find her stroller wheel, which had rolled under a parked car. He wrote the report without any visible annoyance. He directed traffic around the scene with clear, confident gestures. When Harold finally eased the car past the scene, Caspian glanced up. Just for a second, he had this expression on his face, not the forced customer service smile she was used to from people who recognized the Beaumont car. Just a plain, human expression that said, "Yeah, this is hard, but it's fine." She thought about him for 3 days before she did anything about it. She went back to that block. She knew it was strange. She knew that, objectively, walking back to a street corner because you'd seen a police officer do his job well was not a particularly rational impulse. She went anyway, twice. On the 3rd time, she got lucky, or the universe intervened, depending on how you're keeping track. She was coming out of a bookshop on the same block and carrying 2 paperbacks and a coffee that was already fighting a losing battle against the October wind, when someone's dog, a large, enthusiastic golden retriever, bolted from its owner's grip, ran directly at her, and managed to knock both the books and the coffee out of her hands in one elegant, catastrophic motion. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." But it wasn't the dog owner's voice that reached her first. It was his. "Here, I've got it." And Caspian Thorne was crouching at her feet, collecting soggy paperbacks from the sidewalk with the kind of calm efficiency that she was starting to realize was just his default mode. She stood there for a moment, holding the empty cup, and he looked up. Their eyes met. His were a clear, steady gray, the kind of gray that wasn't dull, but the color of a sky about to change. "These yours?" he said, holding up the books. "Yes, thank you, She stopped. "You're the officer. From Tuesday, the accident." He stood, looking mildly surprised. Yeah, you were in the car." "The black one?" "Yes." A pause. The retriever's owner had appeared and was apologizing extensively to both of them. Caspian told her it was fine. Her dog seemed great, really. She left, and then they were just 2 people standing on a wet sidewalk with nothing immediately requiring their attention, which is the exact condition under which most important things happen. "Can I buy you another coffee?" he said. "Least I can do. I did let the dog get away." "You weren't holding the dog?" "No, but I was standing close enough that I probably could have caught the leash." She laughed. It came out surprised, the way a laugh does when something is genuinely funnier than you expected. "Caspian," he said, extending a hand. "Callista." They shook hands in the middle of the sidewalk, like 2 people who had no idea what was about to happen to them. The next 6 months were the best 6 months of Callista's life, which she would say this later, to people who found it almost impossible to believe. "The best 6 months?" they'd ask. "You were broke half the time." And she would nod and say, "Yeah, that's part of why." It's a specific kind of freedom, learning to live on less. Not that she glorified poverty, she didn't, and neither did Caspian, who worked 60-hour weeks and still sometimes had to choose between getting his car's transmission fixed and keeping his grocery budget intact. That part wasn't romantic. That part was real. But what happened inside that reality, the way they built something together out of nothing her father had provided, that was the part she couldn't explain to people who hadn't felt it. She got a job, a genuine one. She'd studied art history at Yale because it was the one major her father hadn't tried to redirect, and now she worked as a junior curatorial assistant at a mid-size gallery in Brooklyn that smelled like linseed oil and old wood. And she made $43,000 a year and felt, for the first time in her memory, like she had actually earned something. They lived together in Caspian's apartment in Flatbush. It was a third-floor walk-up, in a building where one of the radiators knocked all winter, and the bathroom tile had a crack shaped vaguely like the state of Florida. Callista put a plant on the windowsill. She hung a print she'd found at a street market above the kitchen table. She made the cold, and a drafty apartment into something that felt like a home, and was unreasonably proud of this. Caspian worked the day tour, which meant he was up at 5 and out the door by 6. Some mornings she'd hear him moving around the kitchen, trying to be quiet, and she'd lie in the half-dark and feel the shape of her own contentment. This solid, quiet thing in her chest that had nothing to do with square footage or investment portfolios. He had a way of being present that she'd never experienced in anyone before. When she talked, he listened without redirecting. When something was hard, he didn't immediately try to solve it. He'd sit with her in the hard part first, which she hadn't realized was something she'd been missing for her entire life. He told her about the job honestly, which was something nobody ever really did. "People want to think it's all adrenaline," he said once. They were eating takeout on the floor because they hadn't gotten around to buying a proper table yet. But most of it is just being present in someone's worst day, over and over. A domestic call where you can see the kids watching from the stairs. A mental health call where someone's been in crisis for 12 hours before anyone called. You sit in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning for a 70-year-old man who has nobody, just so he's not alone. 6 hours. You just sit there. Well, it's because that's the thing that's needed. He paused, looking down at his food. "The hard part isn't the danger," he said. "The hard part is carrying all those bad days home and figuring out where to put them." She reached over and took his hand. He looked up at her. "You're good at it, though," she said. "The job." "How do you know?" "Because you still care. The ones who stop caring, you can tell. They get that look. You don't have it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a speech. It was 2 people on a floor with a cardboard box for a table, and it was genuinely enough. Cornelius Beaumont, however, had been very busy for those 6 months, and Callista was about to find out exactly how busy. Cornelius Beaumont had not built a $4 billion empire by letting things he didn't like continue unchallenged. He had discovered Caspian approximately 3 weeks after the relationship began. His head of private security, a former federal investigator named Greer, who had worked for Cornelius for 11 years and had long since stopped being surprised by what he was asked to do, had put together a full dossier within 48 hours of receiving the order. Cornelius read it at his desk in the east wing of the Greenwich estate, in the office that smelled of leather and something faintly antiseptic, like ambition that had been distilled into furniture. He read every page twice. Caspian Thorne, age 31, patrol officer, NYPD, 6 years, decorated twice, no criminal record, no significant assets. Current salary, approximately $72,000 annually. Lives in a rental apartment, no stock portfolio, no property holdings, No family wealth on record. Parents deceased. Raised by a paternal uncle, a retired schoolteacher in Vermont. Cornelius set the file down. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. The good one, and the one on the high shelf that he didn't open for anyone, and sat back. No family wealth. That was the sentence that landed hardest. Not the salary, not the apartment, the lack of foundation. Cornelius viewed money the way some people view oxygen. Not as a luxury, but as a necessity so fundamental that its absence made everything else irrelevant. A man with no assets had no leverage. A man with no leverage had no power. A man with no power was, in Cornelius's privately held cosmology, not a man to be taken seriously. And his daughter, his only child, the sole heir to everything he had spent his entire adult life constructing, was apparently cooking dinners in a drafty apartment with this man. He called Greer back in. "I want options," he said. "Quiet ones." Greer knew what that meant. He'd heard quiet options before. He pulled out his notebook. The first move was simple. Money. And Cornelius had someone approach Caspian at the precinct. Not directly, not with a check, nothing that clumsy. He sent an intermediary, a lawyer named Davenport, who specialized in arrangements that didn't require paperwork. The offer was clean. $250,000, transferred into any account Caspian named, in exchange for ending the relationship, relocating to another city, and signing a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from ever contacting Callista Beaumont again. Davenport relayed the meeting afterward. He listened to the whole thing, Davenport said. Didn't interrupt, didn't get angry. And, Cornelius said, he said, "Tell Mr. Beaumont that his daughter is a grown woman, and I love her, and if he'd like to have a conversation about that, my door is open." And then he asked me to leave the precinct. Cornelius was quiet for a long moment. He didn't take it. "No, sir. Not even a counter? Nothing?" Cornelius refiled the information. A man who wouldn't take $250,000 was either stupid or principled. Cornelius had no particular tolerance for either. He moved to the second option. What Cornelius arranged next was more sophisticated. It required Greer, 2 off-duty officers on Cornelius's informal payroll, a fabricated complaint, and the cooperation of a precinct captain who had years ago accepted a substantial campaign contribution from a Beaumont-affiliated political action committee and had not forgotten the source. The complaint alleged that Officer Thorne had used excessive force during a traffic stop 6 weeks prior. There was a video, edited carefully enough to be convincing without being ironclad. There were 2 witnesses, both of whose testimonies Greer had personally reviewed for consistency. Internal Affairs opened a case, and Caspian came home that Thursday not knowing that his career was being taken apart by a man he'd never met. He came home to find Callista making pasta on the stove and the apartment smelling like garlic, and she'd put on the specific playlist that meant she'd had a good day at the gallery, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at the scene before she heard him come in and turned around with a sauce-covered spoon. "How was your day?" she asked. He almost told her. He stood there for a full 3 seconds, deciding whether to say, "Actually, Internal Affairs opened a file on me today, and I don't understand why." "Fine," he said. "Yours?" She told him about a painting she'd been researching, a minor Dutch Golden Age piece that the gallery had acquired, and that she'd been quietly building a case for as more significant than its current attribution suggested. Her face did this thing it always did when she talked about work she loved. It opened up. I shed all its armor, went fully bright. He listened. He asked questions. He ate the pasta. He would handle the IA file. He wasn't going to bring this home. 3 weeks later came the night of the rain. The IA investigation had progressed in ways that Caspian's union rep was beginning to describe as unusually aggressive. A disciplinary hearing had been scheduled. The 2 witnesses had given their statements. The edited video was being presented as evidence. His captain, a man he'd respected for years, had called him in and said, with genuine discomfort, "Caspian, someone wants this to go somewhere. I don't know who, but there's pressure I haven't seen before." On the night it came apart, Cornelius had arranged for the final piece, the phone seizure. Caspian had been called in to manage a scene involving a 3-car accident on a rain-slicked stretch of Atlantic Avenue. It was a genuine emergency call. Someone had been injured, but Greer had made sure the 2 off-duty officers on Cornelius's payroll were positioned nearby. The moment the scene was controlled and Caspian stepped aside to make a call, the call he was composing to Callista, the "I'm sorry, I'm coming home," that he'd typed out and was about to send, they moved in. His phone was seized under the pretext of it being potential evidence. His badge was temporarily suspended, pending the hearing. He was told to sit in the back of a cruiser and wait for a supervisor. And in the limo, parked 3 blocks away, Cornelius Beaumont took Caspian's phone from Greer, read the message on the screen, and deleted it. Callista waited 3 hours. The lasagna went cold. She didn't know. Not yet. But in the Beaumont family, ignorance had always had a shelf life, and Callista's was running out faster than her father realized. And the thing about Cornelius Beaumont was that he was meticulous in every area of his life except one. He had never developed a healthy respect for his daughter's intelligence. He'd spent 26 years underestimating her because she was soft, where he was hard, emotionally fluent, where he was arithmetically fluent, and because she chose beauty over power in every room she entered. He mistook these things for smallness, for limitation. He did not know about the shoebox. Miss Callista had been keeping what she privately called her documentation box since she was 16 years old. It had started because of the first time she'd caught her father doing something that felt wrong. A conversation she'd overheard where he described one of his employees as a necessary casualty, and she had written it down in a notebook because even at 16, she understood instinctively that facts mattered and memory distorted facts. Over the years, the box had grown to include notes, imprintouts, names, dates, overhead fragments of conversations she'd never been supposed to hear. She'd started adding to it again, quietly, since the IA investigation began. She didn't have proof yet, but she had a pattern. And a pattern, in Callista's experience of living with the man who'd taught her without meaning to how power worked, was always the beginning of proof. The night Caspian came home, late, badgeless, but with the careful expressionlessness he wore when something was bad, she watched his face and understood that the threshold had been crossed. This was no longer something he could manage quietly. This was her father, at full deployment. She made tea. She sat him down at the kitchen table under the print she'd hung from the street market, and she said, "Tell me everything." He told her. When he finished, she sat back. She was quiet for a long moment, not the quiet of someone trying to find words, but the quiet of someone who already has them and is deciding the right order. "My father did this," she said. It wasn't a question. "Callista, don't." Not angry, clear. I've been watching him operate my whole life. This has his fingerprints all over it. The edited video, the paid witnesses, the captain who suddenly has pressure from nowhere. That's not a coincidence, Cass. That's a project. He looked at her across the table. I didn't want to put this on you. I know, and I love you for that. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. But I'm in this. I was always in this. He just forgot that. Cornelius thought he had finally won. He had stripped the badge, deleted the message, neutralized the threat. But he didn't realize that his own daughter had just started building the case that would bring everything he'd constructed, all of it, down to the ground. The disciplinary hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in November. A grey light came through institutional windows. Caspian sat in a hard chair on one side of a long table and listened to the case being made against him with the specific stillness of someone who has learned that anger burns fuel you might need later. His union rep, a compact, energetic woman named Torres, who had been in this room dozens of times and had the posture of someone who'd stopped being intimidated by it long ago, sat beside him. She'd seen the video. She'd interviewed both witnesses. She'd told Caspian privately the night before, someone spent real money on this. This isn't a grudge from a random complainant. Whoever set this up has resources. I know who it is, Caspian had said. Torres had looked at him steadily. Then we need to find the thread. Give me anything you have. The hearing went badly. Not catastrophically. Torres was too good for catastrophic, but badly. The video was damning enough to plant doubt. The witnesses were consistent. The captain gave testimony that was technically neutral and practically devastating. Caspian's record was used in his favor, but records only go so far when the story being told in front of you is vivid and specific. He walked out of the building at noon into a cold November sky with his badge returned provisionally, a 60-day administrative leave on the table pending further review, and Torres beside him saying, "This isn't over," in the voice of someone who means it. He sat in his car for 20 minutes before he drove home. The apartment in winter had its own character. The cracked Florida-shaped tile in the bathroom sweated cold air. The knocking radiator became their ambient soundtrack, irregular as a heartbeat that kept changing rhythm. Callista lined the windowsills with things she found at the weekend market. A small clay pot, a smooth piece of green sea glass, a postcard of the Azores that someone had sent to a stranger and that she'd found tucked in the back of a used book. She was documenting. Every morning while Caspian slept, she was at the kitchen table with her laptop, cross-referencing. She had found the connection to the off-duty officers. A public record of a disciplinary complaint against one of them that included buried in the exhibits a reference to consulting fees paid through a shell company. She found the shell company. She ran the shell company back through 3 layers of Delaware Incorporation records. The 4th layer had a name she recognized, a subsidiary of Beaumont Capital Partners. She stared at that for a long time. Dad, she thought, how could you? She didn't mean it as a question. She meant it as grief. She meant it the way you mean something when you've known it was coming, and it still takes your breath away when it arrives. She printed the document and added it to the shoebox. In the evenings, she and Caspian did what people do when the world outside is cold and complicated. They cooked together in a small kitchen that required them to navigate around each other, which they had turned into a kind of dance. They watched old films on a laptop propped on a stack of books. They read in the same room. He had a habit of reading aloud occasionally, A paragraph, a passage, a sentence he'd found that felt worth saying out loud. And she had come to love this habit with a specific, inquiet fierceness. One night, deep into December, they were lying on the couch with a blanket that had been a thrift store purchase and that was inexplicably the softest blanket either of them had ever owned. And Caspian said, apropos of nothing, "I want to marry you." She turned to look at him. "I know the timing is terrible," he said. "I know my career is in limbo and we're eating on a budget and your father is actively trying to destroy my life." "All true," she said. But I want you to know that this is what I want. You, specifically. This life, specifically. Not a better version of it where everything is resolved. This one." She was quiet. Outside, a car passed and threw a brief stripe of light across the ceiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I'll marry you. Obviously. What did you think I was going to say?" He laughed. A real one. Full and released. The kind that came from somewhere central. She buried her face in his shoulder and felt his arm come around her, and the radiator knocked twice, and outside it was deeply, completely cold, and the apartment was warm. Cornelius found out about the engagement 3 days later. He had been monitoring Callista's phone through a surveillance application his security team had installed 2 years ago during what he described to himself as a precautionary measure. He had heard the conversation. He had listened to the part about this life, and specifically, he had sat in his heated study and felt something move in his chest that he did not know how to name. It might have been grief. It might have been the compressed, distorted shape that grief takes when a man has spent 30 years teaching himself not to feel it. He poured the scotch again. Then he called Greer and said, "New phase." The new phase was the apartment. Cornelius purchased the building. This required approximately 48 hours and was accomplished through an intermediary operating through a series of LLC entities that even a careful investigator would need weeks to untangle. Once he owned the building, he instructed the new management company to serve a notice of lease termination on grounds that the building was being scheduled for renovation. They had 60 days. The notice arrived on a Thursday. Callista was alone when it came. A certified envelope slid under the door, which was technically against proper notice procedures, but which the management company apparently didn't care about. She opened it at the kitchen table, read it twice, and sat very still for a few minutes. Then she called Torres. "My father bought the building," she said. Torres was quiet for 2 seconds. "Are you sure?" "I have the documentation of the shell company. I have the incorporation records. I have a paper trail from his capital partners to the LLC that just purchased this property." A pause. "I've been building it for 6 weeks." Torres was quiet again, but it was the quiet of someone recalibrating. "Callista, what do you do exactly?" "I work in a gallery." "Have you ever considered law?" "Focus." Torres focused. They talked for 40 minutes. When Caspian came home that evening, Callista met him at the door with her laptop and the shoebox and said, "Sit down. I have to show you something." He sat. She showed him everything. He went through it page by page. She watched his face, the way the careful stillness shifted, the way something hardened beneath it, not into anger, but into a specific, resolute clarity. "This is enough," he said, when he'd finished. "This is enough to go to the department's inspector general. The witnesses, the shell company, the building purchase. This is a coordinated campaign of harassment and corruption, Callista. This could result in criminal charges." "I know," she said. "He's your father." She met his eyes. "He stopped being my father the night he deleted your message." She said it quietly, without drama. "The way you say something you have thought about for a long time and are now finished thinking about." Caspian put his arms around her in that cold kitchen and held her for a long time. He didn't say it was going to be okay, because he didn't know that it was. He just held her, which is its own kind of truth. But there was something Caspian had not yet told her, something he had been carrying for much longer than the IA investigation, much longer than Cornelius Beaumont's war, something he had promised someone years ago that he would not use as a shield or a shortcut or an escape. He was about to break that promise. 312 miles north of Brooklyn, in a farmhouse outside Burlington, and Vermont that sat at the end of a dirt road and had no signage of any kind, a man named Callista Thorne was reading the morning paper. He was in his 70s, wiry and white-haired, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms where enormous things were decided and had learned, somewhere along the way, that the most powerful position in any room is the one where you look like you belong to none of them. His secretary, he still used that word, secretary, because he distrusted euphemism in professional titles, knocked and entered with a message. "Mr. Greer has made contact again," she said. "The same individual. Beaumont's man." "Yes, sir." Callista folded the paper. He had been watching Cornelius Beaumont's campaign against his nephew for approximately 6 weeks now. He had been aware of it almost from the beginning. Yeah, because Callista Thorne had spent 50 years building an intelligence apparatus that was better funded and more quietly efficient than most government organizations, and because Cornelius Beaumont, despite his considerable resources, did not know that the shell company trail he was using led somewhere Alistair's people had been watching for years. He had not intervened. This was deliberate. Alistair had put Caspian through what he called, when asked to describe it, a reckoning, not a test. Inexactly, that word implied too much engineering, too much top-down design, more like a condition. Alistair had given Caspian everything a young man needs to become hollow: wealth, access, the certainty of comfort, and then, when Caspian was 24, Caspian had walked into his uncle's house on a Tuesday and said, "I want to become a police officer." Alistair had looked at him for a long time. "You understand what you're giving up," he said. "I understand what I'm choosing," Caspian said, and Alistair had let him go, had watched from a careful distance as his nephew chose a hard life over an easy one, as he sat in hospital waiting rooms for strangers and came home with the weight of other people's worst days and kept going back anyway. As he met a woman with warm, dark eyes and chose her without knowing what she was worth, without knowing what he himself was worth, because wealth had never been a factor in his calculation. That, Alistair thought, reading the file his secretary had brought, is what I was waiting to see. He stood up. "Get my car," he said, "and call Caspian." Caspian's phone rang at 7:15 in the morning on a day in January when the Brooklyn sky was the color of old tin. He looked at the screen, his uncle's number. He picked up. Caspian. Alistair. A brief pause, the kind that carries weight. "It's time," Alistair said. "I think you know that." Caspian was standing at the kitchen window. Callista was still asleep. Outside, a pigeon made its labored way across the fire escape. Everything in the apartment was very still. "He bought our building," Caspian said. "I know. He corrupted the investigation." "I know that too." She built the documentation herself. She's been doing it for 6 weeks. She doesn't know—" He stopped. "She doesn't know anything about the other side of this." "No," Alistair said. "She doesn't. And she's been fighting as if you had nothing behind you, because you told her you had nothing behind you." "I didn't lie to her." "No," you omitted, which in some ways is harder to carry. A pause. "Come up this weekend. Bring her." Caspian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bedroom door. "She's going to be angry," he said. "Probably. She's going to think I was performing poverty or something like that. That the whole thing was a—" "It wasn't." "I know it wasn't. But she might—" "Caspian," Alistair said, and there was something in his voice, or a old and patient steadiness. "She is a woman who chose you specifically, who chose the cracked tile apartment and the $60 a week grocery budget and the cold kitchen over the estate with the gold-spiked gates. I have been watching her. If you think she is the kind of person who would mistake your choice for deception, you don't know her as well as you think you do." Caspian stood in the grey January light for a long moment. "This weekend," he said. "This weekend," Alistair confirmed, and he told her that night. Not in Vermont, not in front of Alistair, not staged with any particular setting or arrangement. They were doing the dishes, standing side by side at the kitchen sink, the radio playing something low and jazz-inflected, and he said, "I have to tell you something." She kept washing the bowl she was holding. "Okay. My uncle, my father's brother, Callista Thorne, He paused. "He's not a retired schoolteacher." She turned to look at him, water dripping from her hands. "He's wealthy." "How wealthy?" A beat. "Trillionaire wealthy." The word landed in the kitchen with the weight of something geological. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze. No deflection, no softening, just the same steady grey eyes that had been looking at her honestly for a year and a half. "You've been working a 60-hour week," she said slowly, "eating on a budget, living in a cracked tile apartment." "Yes." "By choice." "Yes." "Not because you had to, because you wanted to know what it felt like to build something on your own, without any cushion." He nodded. "My uncle made me a condition of the inheritance, not his idea of a test. He was clear about that. He just said he wouldn't feel right passing on that kind of resources to someone who'd never known what it cost to earn something. He told me to go build a life. He said when I'd done that, really done it, lived in it, let it shape me, then come back." She turned back to the sink, turned off the water, stood there for a moment with her hands wet. Then she said, "How long have you known about us, about the situation with my father? How long have you known you could stop it?" "I could have stopped it faster if I'd called Alistair." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet. "Because I didn't want to save us with money. I wanted to save us with truth. I wanted Greer's corruption on record. I wanted your documentation, your 6 weeks of work, to be the foundation. I didn't want to be the man who made a problem disappear with a phone call and called that a resolution." She turned to face him again. "That's a very principled position," she said. "Are you angry?" A long pause. Outside the window, the city continued its usual composition. Sirens, voices, a car door, music from somewhere high up. "I need 10 minutes, she said. Don't talk to me for 10 minutes. She went to the window. She stood there, looking out at Brooklyn. He sat at the kitchen table and waited. 8 minutes later, she came back. "You didn't use it as an out," she said. "When things got hard, you stayed in it. Yes, you chose the apartment. Every morning, you chose me without any of that in the equation. Callista, you are the equation. She stood in front of him and put both hands on his face and looked at him for a long time. I need to meet your uncle, she said. This weekend, he said. Good. She kissed him. The radiator knocked, the jazz played, the apartment was warm. The drive to Vermont took 5 hours through a winter landscape that felt like the inside of a quiet thought. White fields, bare trees, a sky the pale blue of very old denim. Callista sat in the passenger seat and watched the distance open up and thought about what she was driving toward. They arrived at the farmhouse in the early afternoon. It was exactly as unpretentious as she'd expected from what Caspian had described. A long, low structure of old timber with a wide porch. Wood smoke rising from 2 chimneys, no security gate, no imposing anything. It looked like the home of someone who'd stopped needing to impress people a very long time ago. Callista Thorne met them at the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was taller than she'd imagined, thinner than she'd imagined, and with the kind of face that had been lived in thoroughly. He looked at her with attention, not the calculating appraisal her father always gave people, that inventory-taking scan that categorized and assigned value. This was different. This was the look of someone genuinely curious. Callista Beaumont, he said. Mr. Thorne. Alistair, he shook her hand. I've been looking forward to meeting you for some time. He brought them inside to a living room full of books and afternoon light. There was a fire. There was tea. There was, Callista noticed with something almost like fondness, a crack in the window frame plugged with a piece of folded paper, the kind of minor maintenance deferred by someone who cared more about what was on the shelves than the condition of the frame. She liked him immediately. She distrusted this slightly, because she was used to distrusting her own immediate reactions where powerful men were concerned. But Alistair Thorne was not performing anything. Now, he poured the tea himself. He asked her about the gallery, about the Dutch Golden Age piece she'd been researching, about her documentation work on the Beaumont case. And he listened to the answers with real attention, tracking specific details, asking follow-up questions that showed he'd actually absorbed what she'd said. Your instincts are good, he said at one point. The shell company trail was the right thread to pull. I had time to work on it, she said. And administrative leave has its uses. He looked at her. Then he looked at Caspian. Something passed between them. Not quite satisfaction, not quite pride, something quieter and more complex than either. Tell me what you want to accomplish, Alistair said. In terms of your father, tell me what a good outcome looks like to you. She thought about it carefully before she answered. I don't want to destroy him, she said. He's my father. I want him to stop. I want the IA case cleared. I want the witnesses to retract. I want the officers off his payroll. I want the building back in the hands of people who actually own it legitimately. A pause. And I want him to understand that what he did had consequences. Not to punish him, to reach him. I don't think anyone has reached him in a very long time. Alistair was quiet. That, he said, is a more sophisticated objective than most people bring to situations like this. I've been watching him operate for 26 years, she said. I know the only language he understands: systems, ownership, what controls what. She set down her tea. So let's talk about what Thorne Capital actually owns. 2 weeks later, Cornelius Beaumont received a meeting request. It came through his corporate counsel, which was unusual. It referenced a matter of material significance to Beaumont Capital Partners' current portfolio positioning, which was the kind of language designed to get a certain kind of man into a room without telling him why. Cornelius, who had written this kind of language himself many times, recognized it and came anyway. The conference room was on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan that Cornelius had never had reason to enter before. It was a quiet, unwell-appointed room with no corporate branding on the walls, which Cornelius noted. Companies that needed to brand their conference rooms were companies that weren't confident enough in their reputation to let the room speak for itself. Callista Thorne was already seated when Cornelius arrived. Cornelius recognized him after a moment. Thorne. He knew the name. He did not fully know the scale of it, and because Callista Thorne had spent 5 decades operating beneath the level where names became common knowledge. Seated beside Callista was Caspian, in a suit for the first time, looking entirely composed, and seated across from them both, in a chair that she had positioned herself, was Callista. Cornelius stopped in the doorway. He looked at his daughter, her straight back, her calm hands folded on the table, the warm, dark eyes that had always been her mother's, and he felt something crack open in him that he hadn't given access to in a very long time. He sat down. Callista. Dad. Quiet. Clear. Please let Callista speak first. What Callista laid out over the next 40 minutes was not a threat. It was a documentation of reality, delivered without drama or embellishment. Thorne Capital, he explained, had been accumulating positions in Beaumont Capital's key assets for approximately 8 years. They're not hostile positions, patient ones. The kind of long-horizon investments that only a very specific kind of institutional capital makes, the kind that doesn't need to move quickly because it has no pressure to exit. Beaumont Capital's real estate holdings, its media subsidiaries, its logistics infrastructure, Thorne Capital held, through various entities, stakes in the companies that held stakes in the companies that Cornelius believed he controlled. Cornelius sat very still. "Until this is not a hostile action," Callista said. "It's a disclosure. You deserve to know the structural reality of your position." "Why now?" Cornelius said. His voice was controlled, but something in it had shifted register. "Because," Callista said, "my nephew has asked me to make this disclosure rather than take action. The action available to us is considerable. We could move on 3 of your key infrastructure holdings within 48 hours. The impact on Beaumont Capital's liquidity position would be significant." Cornelius looked at Caspian. Caspian held his gaze without hostility, without satisfaction, without any of the expressions Cornelius might have expected from a man who just had his life systematically dismantled and was now in a position to return the favor. "What do you want?" Cornelius said. "I want the IA investigation cleared," Caspian said. "I want the 2 officers terminated from their consulting arrangement. I want Captain Reyes reinstated to the position he was effectively pressured out of. I want the building returned to its original owners at the original purchase price. And," Callista said, "I want you to come to our wedding." The room went very quiet. Cornelius looked at his daughter, really looked at her, the way he hadn't in years, the way the motion of building and acquiring and protecting had crowded out. He saw his wife's eyes. He saw 26 years of a child trying to tell him something and being met with an inventory. He looked at Caspian, the patrol officer who hadn't taken the money, who had sat in hospital waiting rooms at 2 in the morning for strangers, who had chosen a cracked tile apartment and the daughter of a man actively trying to destroy him, over and over again. He looked at Alistair, who had run a $1 trillion enterprise from a farmhouse in Vermont and was sitting in a conference room in Midtown in a flannel shirt because he couldn't be bothered to change. Something in Cornelius Beaumont's face, the tight, controlled architecture of it, shifted. Not collapsed. Shifted, like a structure settling. "Your mother," he said to Callista, very quietly. "She would have liked him." "I know," she said. What happened after was not a fairy tale transformation. Cornelius Beaumont did not become a different man overnight. Men who have spent 30 years building a scarcity-minded fortress around their heart do not dismantle it in a conference room, no matter how good the documentation, but they dismantle it in pieces. He made the calls. The IA case was quietly closed. Fabricated evidence withdrawn. Witnesses recanting under pressure they didn't need to understand the origin of. Caspian's badge was returned, and Captain Reyes got a phone call from a precinct commander who suddenly had renewed enthusiasm for his record. The building in Flatbush stayed. The lease was extended, the renovation notice withdrawn, the management company restructured. Cornelius did this himself. He didn't tell Callista he'd done it. She found out from the building's new superintendent, who told her the previous owners had sold back at a loss and mentioned that the whole transaction had seemed, in his words, real unusual. The wedding was small. A Saturday in late April, in a community garden in Brooklyn that one of Caspian's colleagues had connections to. Callista wore her mother's earrings. Caspian wore the suit from the Midtown conference room. Cornelius sat in the third row and did not speak much. But he stayed the entire day. He stayed through the dinner, which was catered from a neighborhood restaurant that charged $40 a head. He stayed through the dancing, which was improvised and occasionally chaotic on the uneven garden path. He stayed until the end. At some point late in the evening, he found himself standing beside Callista Thorne at the edge of the garden, both of them watching Caspian and Callista dance badly and joyfully to a song that neither of them seemed to know all the words to. "He chose this," Cornelius said. "Not a question, not quite. More like working something out." "He chose her," Alistair said. The rest came with her." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "I was protecting her." "I know you were." "I was—" He stopped. The word came slowly. "Wrong." Alistair didn't respond immediately. He watched his nephew lift his wife off the ground briefly, both of them laughing. He watched Callista's face. The way it opened up, shed all its armor, went fully bright. "Cornelius," he said finally, "I've run something worth more than most countries' GDP for the better part of 5 decades. Do you know what the most valuable thing I ever put into it was?" Cornelius waited, knowing when to let go. They kept the apartment for another 2 years, by choice. The building found better ownership. The radiator was finally fixed in their second winter. The tile in the bathroom stayed cracked. Caspian wanted to patch it. Callista said to leave it because it reminded her of something she wasn't ready to let go of yet. The Florida-shaped crack stayed. The Beaumont-Thorne negotiation, as it came to be known in the financial press, which covered it as a consolidation story and never understood its actual origin, resulted in a restructuring that preserved most of Cornelius's operating businesses while placing Thorne Capital in a position of structural influence. Alistair did not interfere with daily operations. He just made certain that the architecture was in place to correct any future decisions that would harm people the way the previous decisions had. Callista left the gallery for a larger institution with a better research budget. She found the Dutch Golden Age painting she'd been arguing for was in fact significantly more important than its current attribution. The paper she published on it was modest in academic terms, but produced a small eruption of enthusiasm in the field. Caspian went back to work. He made sergeant 2 years later. He still sat in hospital waiting rooms at 2 in the morning when that was what was needed. He still came home and looked for somewhere to put the weight of the bad days. He found it. He always had. One evening in their 3rd year of the apartment, Callista was at the kitchen table with a book, and Caspian came home from a late shift with a bag of groceries and a slightly muddy coat. He put the groceries away. He came and sat across from her at the table with the print from the street market still above them on the wall. He opened his own book. They read. The radiator, newly fixed, hummed instead of knocking. Outside, the city did its evening composition. The plant on the windowsill had been replaced 3 times, but there was always a plant on the windowsill. At some point, Caspian read a sentence aloud. She didn't look up from her own page, just listened. Good, she said. Good, he said. The apartment was warm. Wow, what an ending. I have to know, what was the best part of the story for you? Was it the moment Cornelius realized his mistake, or the secret reveal at the end? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this emotional ride, please like and subscribe for more stories like this one.